The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which felt wrong somehow. Important things, the kind that rearranged the architecture of a life, should arrive on days with more gravity to them. Tuesdays had always belonged to grocery lists and dentist appointments, and the quiet, manageable disappointments of ordinary living. Not this. Not a single sheet of legal stationery folded into thirds, bearing the name of a notary firm in the county seat, and the words, "Estate of Gerald Harmon Voss" across the top, in the kind of typeface that expected to be taken seriously. Margaret Voss stood at her kitchen counter and read it twice. Then she set it down beside her coffee cup, which had long gone cold, and stood very still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the house around her. The refrigerator's low hum, the furnace kicking on in the basement, the particular silence of a home where children had once lived and now only memory did. Her father was dead. She had known that for 11 days already. She had driven 4 hours to stand beside his bed in the hospice facility and hold a hand that barely gripped back, and she had watched the monitors and listened to the nurses speak in careful, practiced tones. And she had understood, in the way you could only understand such things, when you were directly inside them, that Gerald Voss was leaving without having said most of the things that needed saying. That was not unusual. In her family, the unsaid had always occupied more space than anything spoken aloud. What she had not known, or had not allowed herself to think about clearly, was what came after. The letter instructed her to appear at the offices of Whitmore and Associates in the city of Carver Falls no later than the 15th of the month to participate in the formal reading and distribution of the estate. The language was polite and precise, and entirely devoid of warmth, which suited it perfectly. She folded it back along its original creases and tucked it beneath the salt shaker on the counter. Then she went to the window and looked out at the yard, at the dead November grass, and the bare oak that had stood there since before she was born. And she thought about her brothers. There were 2 of them. Douglas, the eldest, who had managed their father's agricultural holdings for the better part of 2 decades, and who had long operated on the quiet assumption that this management constituted a form of ownership. And then there was Richard, 3 years younger than Douglas, and 4 years older than Margaret, who had spent his adult life in a state of barely concealed resentment toward Douglas, and barely concealed condescension toward everyone else. The 2 of them had circled each other for years, like dogs on opposite ends of the same yard, and their father's illness had not softened that. If anything, it had concentrated it. Margaret had watched from a distance. She had always watched from a distance where her brothers were concerned. It was not passivity exactly, or it was not only that. It was the particular positioning of someone who had learned early that she occupied a different category in the family's internal accounting, one that could not be changed by effort or presence or the patient accumulation of demonstrated love. And she was the youngest. She was the daughter. She was the one who had left for college and then stayed away. And while her reasons for staying away were real and hers and not available for argument, they had calcified in her family's memory into a simple narrative of absence. She had come back eventually. Not to the farm itself, but close enough. A small house in the next county, a teaching position at the regional elementary school, a life that fit her, if not perfectly, then at least honestly. She had come back because her mother got sick first, and someone needed to be nearby, and neither Douglas nor Richard had adjusted their lives to accommodate that need. She had arranged the appointments and driven to the hospital and sat with her mother through the long institutional afternoons. And she had done it without being asked, and without being thanked. And when her mother died 3 years ago, she had continued to do the same for her father, and that too had gone mostly unacknowledged. She was used to it. That was the honest thing to say about it. She was used to it in the way that you became used to weather. Not happily, but thoroughly enough that you stopped expecting anything different. The morning of the read-in, she woke at 5 and lay in the dark, thinking about money. Not the estate money, not yet, but her own. The figures were not complicated because there were not enough of them to require complexity. Her salary covered the mortgage, and the car payment, and the utilities, and the groceries, and not much beyond that. She had a savings account with enough in it to replace the water heater if it went, which she suspected it would before spring. She had debt from her mother's final expenses that she had put on a credit card and paid against slowly, as if trying not to disturb something sleeping. She had no cushion, no margin, no part of her finances that could be reasonably described as comfortable. She drove to Carver Falls in the kind of early winter light that made everything look tired. The fields on either side of the highway were stripped and gray. Other drivers moved past her with the purposeful blankness of people who had somewhere particular to be. Her brothers were already in the waiting room when she arrived. Douglas sat with his hands on his knees, wearing the expression he always wore in situations that required patience from him, which was an expression of barely managed superiority. Richard was at the window, checking something on his phone, and he looked up when she came in, but did not stand. She sat down across from both of them and said hello, and they said hello back, and the three of them waited in the particular silence of people who share blood and almost nothing else. Walter Whitmore was a man in his late 60s who had been handling estate law in Carver Falls for long enough that he had perfected the art of delivering complicated information in a tone that suggested the complications were someone else's business. He led them into a conference room that smelled of old carpet and whatever cleaning product had been used on the table, and he arranged his papers with practiced economy, and he began. Gerald Voss had died, possessed of a substantial estate. The farmland itself, some 800 acres of mixed tillable and pasture ground, was divided in 2 equal parcels between Douglas and Richard, with provisions for continued operation and a buyout clause should either wish to sell his portion. The equipment was appraised and allocated. The operating accounts and the liquid assets from the sale of a timber parcel, completed 3 years prior, were split between the 2 sons with a precision that had clearly required significant advance thought. Douglas received the grain bins and the primary homestead. Richard received the secondary property and the machinery he had historically operated. It went on like this for some time. Margaret listened. She understood what she was hearing, which was that her father had thought carefully and at length about how to distribute what he had built, and he had thought about his sons, and he had thought about the land they had worked, and he had done this in a way that was, by its own internal logic, not unreasonable. She waited for her name. When it came, Walter Whitmore paused in the way that people paused when they needed a moment to frame something. He looked at her over his glasses with an expression that was professional and neutral and just slightly too careful to be entirely comfortable. Gerald Voss had left to his daughter, Margaret Ann Voss, the parcel of land located at the northeast corner of the primary farm property, encompassing approximately 6 acres in total, including the pond and its surrounding buffer ground, along with a right-of-way easement for access from County Road 14. For a moment, the room was very quiet. Douglas cleared his throat. It was Richard who spoke first. He said it was just the duck pond, and with a tone that managed to be dismissive and almost sympathetic at the same time, as if he were conveying mildly unfortunate information rather than the contents of a will that their father had apparently signed in full possession of his legal faculties. Douglas said that their father had always been fond of that corner of the property, which was not an explanation or a defense, but seemed intended to function as one. Margaret looked at Walter Whitmore and asked if there was anything else. He said there was not in her case. She nodded. She did not cry in the conference room, which she considered a minor victory. She did not say anything she would need to regret later. She signed the papers that required signing and shook Walter Whitmore's hand and walked out through the waiting room with Douglas and Richard behind her. And in the parking lot, her brothers talked to each other about the buyout clause and the equipment appraisal in voices that had already moved past her entirely. She drove home in the same gray light she had driven in on. She sat in her car in her own driveway for a while, not ready to go inside. And she thought about the duck pond. She knew it. She had known it since childhood, the way you knew everything on a farm you grew up on, as a feature of the landscape rather than a point of attention. It was in the low corner of the northeast field, where the ground softened and water collected, and at some point in the history of the farm, it had been expanded or deepened. She was not sure which, and it had become a permanent thing. On a quarter-acre of still water in a natural depression surrounded by cattails and a stand of willows on the north side. As children, they had caught frogs there. Her father had occasionally fished there on summer evenings, though she could not remember him ever catching much. The pond existed the way many things on a farm existed, as a fact of the place, functional in an indirect sense, ornamental in a minor sense, and not particularly important in any sense that showed up in a balance sheet. 6 acres, she thought. 6 acres, including the water and the buffer ground and the easement. In this county, agricultural land was selling for somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 an acre, depending on soil quality and drainage and a dozen other factors. The buffer ground around the pond was low and wet and would never be tillable. The pond itself was water. Conservatively, generously even, she was looking at perhaps $20,000 or $25,000 in land value if she could find anyone who wanted it, which was not guaranteed. Her brothers had each received something in the range of several $1 million worth of assets. She sat with that for a while. Then she went inside and made dinner, and called a friend, and said that the reading had gone as expected, which was true enough. The weeks that followed had a strange quality to them, as if time were moving at a slightly different speed than normal, and she was the only one who noticed. She went to work. She taught her second graders their multiplication tables and their spelling words, and she attended parent-teacher conferences, and she graded papers in the evenings, and she lived her life with the same careful, honest orderliness she's always had, and beneath all of it, like a low frequency she could feel more than hear, was the knowledge of what she had been given and what she had not been given, and the particular kind of loneliness that came with both. She called her brother Douglas once, about a week after the reading. She was not sure what she intended to say. He picked up, and they talked for several minutes about their father's health in the final months, about arrangements that still needed attending to, about a piece of equipment that Richard was disputing. When she said, as neutrally as she could manage it, that she was thinking about visiting the pond property, Douglas said, "Sure, of course, it's yours now." and that was that. She drove out to the farm on a Saturday in early December, taking County Road 14 to the easement, which was a gravel track rutted from the fall harvest season and not maintained to any particular standard. The 6 acres sat at the edge of the big northeast field, and in the winter light it looked exactly as she remembered it, which was to say, unremarkable. The willow stand was bare. The cattails were broken and brown. The pond itself reflected the sky in a flat, metallic way. A sheet of still water perhaps 100 feet across, at its widest, maybe 70 feet the other direction, edged with ice at the margins, where the shallows had frozen, but open in the center, where it was deeper. She parked at the end of the gravel track and walked the perimeter of the property. The ground was frozen hard enough to carry her weight without difficulty. She moved through the willows and around the cattail margin and stood on the south bank and looked at the water. A duck was there, which struck her as appropriate. A single mallard, sitting motionless near the center, regarding her with the neutral surveillance that ducks seem to apply to everything. She watched it for a moment. It did not move. She tried to feel something definitive about the property, some clear emotion she could organize herself around, anger, perhaps, or grief, or even something simpler like disappointment. What she felt instead was more difficult to name. It was something in the neighborhood of recognition, the quiet acknowledgement of a thing she had suspected for a long time without having it confirmed so explicitly. She had always been the expendable one, and that was not a comfortable thought, and she did not linger in it. But it was there, solid and familiar as the frozen ground under her boots. She walked the perimeter twice, noting the condition of the willows, the depth of the cattails, the way the land sloped toward the pond from the north. There was a small concrete structure at the south end of the pond that she had forgotten about, or perhaps had never consciously noticed as a child. It was low to the ground and overgrown with dead vegetation. But she could see it was a drainage control of some kind, an old pipe and valve assembly that would have allowed the pond to be drained or the water level adjusted. It was rusted and had clearly not been operated in many years, possibly decades. She took photographs on her phone of the pond, the willows, the drainage structure, the gravel track. She was not sure what she intended to do with them. She took them anyway. On the drive home, she stopped at a gas station and bought a coffee she didn't need, and stood beside her car in the cold and thought about money. Again, specifically the kind she did not have, and the ways in which that absence constrained her. The water heater was making sounds it had not made in the fall. One of her back tires was getting thin. She had put off going to the dentist for 8 months because of the co-pay structure on her insurance, and her sister in Ohio had called last month to ask if she was all right, and she had said yes. She was fine, in the way that people said they were fine, when the honest answer was more complicated and more exhausting to explain. What she had was a duck pond. What she needed was about $40,000 and a different life. The idea came to her, not in a single moment, but gradually, the way most useful ideas arrived, through a process of slow accumulation. Over the following 2 weeks, she found herself thinking about the pond at odd moments between classes, while grading in the 15 minutes before sleep. She thought about the drainage structure she had seen at the south end, old and rusted, but structurally there, designed to lower the water level. She thought about what was under the water, which was presumably mud and silt and decades of accumulated organic material, but also possibly, faintly, something else. She could not have said exactly where the thought originated. It was not a logical deduction from specific evidence. It was more like a question that inserted itself and refused to stop asking. Why had her father left her that particular piece of ground? Of all the ways to be dismissive in a will, of all the low-value corners of 800 acres that could have been allocated to a daughter deemed worth very little, why that one? Her father had been a careful man. He had been meticulous with his finances and his records and his decisions. He had written a will that was precise and clearly deliberate in its allocations. The farm equipment distribution alone suggested hours of prior planning. He had given her the duck pond. She turned the question over and over and could not make it settle into anything comfortable. Either it was exactly what it appeared to be, a dismissal so complete it had the quality of a statement, or it was something else entirely, and something she wasn't yet positioned to see. She went back on a Thursday after school, arriving at the property in the flat gray light of a winter afternoon, with maybe 2 hours of usable daylight left. The pond had frozen more thoroughly since her last visit, though the center was still liquid. She walked to the drainage structure at the south end and crouched beside it, brushing away the dead vegetation with her gloved hands. It was an old culvert and valve system, the kind that had been standard on farm ponds for much of the middle of the last century. A concrete head wall with a corrugated metal pipe through it, and a stem valve that could be turned to open or close the outflow. The stem was rusted. The valve handle was gone or had been removed, but the mechanism itself appeared intact, the concrete head wall solid, and the pipe not visibly collapsed. She photographed it carefully. Then she stood and looked at the pond for a long time. It was deep enough in the center that you could not see the bottom. The water had that opaque, dark quality of old farm ponds, colored by decades of leaf tannins and sediment, revealing nothing. She drove home in the dark and sat at her kitchen table with a glass of water and her laptop, and she searched for things she did not know she had needed to know until recently. The cost of pond draining services, the rental rates for pump equipment, the geological history of the county, which had been subject to glacial activity and the particular kinds of subsurface features that glaciated landscapes produced. The history of farm pond construction in the region, which had peaked in certain decades for specific agricultural and government incentive reasons. And then, following a thread she could not entirely explain, she searched for the history of the Voss farm property itself, which was a thing she had never had particular reason to do before. What she found was not dramatic. Old county plat maps, deed transfer records going back to the homestead era, a mention in a 1940s agricultural survey of the property's tile drainage system, a brief notice in the County Historical Society's digital archive about a land transaction in 1962 that had consolidated several adjacent parcels under her grandfather's name. She almost closed the laptop. And then, near the bottom of the Historical Society's search results, she found something that made her sit forward in her chair. It was a scan of a newspaper clipping from 1971. The paper was the Carver Falls Courier, and the clipping was from the business section, which in a rural weekly of that era meant it occupied about 3 column inches and was sandwiched between an advertisement for a farm implement dealer and a notice about a grain co-op meeting. The headline was small and matter-of-fact in the way that local papers were matter-of-fact about things that were considered local business and therefore not requiring of excitement. It said, "Voss property serves as temporary holding site for county agricultural credit records during bank consolidation. She read the article carefully. It was brief and uninformative in the way that brief local news articles were when they were written by someone who understood that their readership already knew most of what was being reported. The county's agricultural lending bank had merged with a larger regional institution in 1971. During the transition, certain records and associated materials had been held at a secure location on private property, while the new institution's facilities were being prepared. The property was identified only as the Voss Farm in northeast Harmon County. That was all. She sat with it for a long time. There were a dozen reasonable explanations for what that article might mean, and most of them were entirely ordinary. Banks moved records. Farms with outbuildings provided storage. Her grandfather had presumably been compensated for the use of his property, and that had been the end of it. She closed the laptop and went to bed. But the question had shifted, had become something slightly sharper and more insistent, and when she lay in the dark listening to the furnace, it was still there, arranged differently now, pointing at something she could not yet see clearly. She began to pay attention to her father's papers. She had a box of them, documents she had collected from the hospice and from his house during the difficult weeks of settling affairs, and she had put the box in her spare bedroom and told herself she would go through it properly when she had the emotional bandwidth for it. She had not yet had the emotional bandwidth. But she went into the spare bedroom and pulled the box out and sat on the floor and began. Most of it was what she expected. Tax records, medical statements, correspondence with the Farm Bureau, old bank statements, a folder of documents related to the sale of timber rights that had generated the liquid assets mentioned in the will, insurance policies in various states of currency and expiration. She went through it all methodically, the way she had learned to do things as a teacher, without rushing, without assuming anything was more or less important than anything else, until she had seen it. Near the bottom of the box, she found an old, expandable folder, the kind with a rubber band closure, that had not been part of the organized filing system, but appeared to have been added to the box separately, perhaps grabbed from somewhere in the house without much thought by whoever had been collecting items. The rubber band had dried and broke when she tried to remove it. Inside were documents from a different era, older paper, typed on typewriters rather than printed, carbon copies in some cases, the slightly blurred duplicates that carbon paper produced. The earliest were from the 1960s. The most recent appeared to be from the mid-1980s. She organized them by date and began reading. They were her grandfather's papers, or some of them. Harmon Voss had died before Margaret was born, which meant she knew him only through stories and photographs and the persistent physical presence of the farm he had built. He had been, by family account, a difficult and private man, so capable and hard-working, and not particularly interested in explaining himself to anyone. The papers confirmed this impression in indirect ways. They were meticulous where they needed to be meticulous, and entirely silent on things that were apparently not intended for documentation. There were land purchase records, correspondence about tile drainage contracts, a set of handwritten accounts from what appeared to be crop years in the late 1960s, each entry precise and unadorned. And then, between two sheets of routine correspondence from 1973, a single handwritten page in her grandfather's angular, deliberate script. It was not addressed to anyone. It was not signed, though she recognized the handwriting from other documents in the folder. It was brief, written in the way that private notes were written, with the compressed shorthand of someone committing information to paper for their own reference rather than for communication. She read it twice before she understood what she was reading. And then she sat on the spare bedroom floor for a very long time, the paper resting on her knees, the box open beside her. The cold December air coming through the window she had cracked without thinking about it earlier. And she felt something shift in her chest that was not grief and was not hope and was not anything she had a reliable name for. But that occupied the space where certainty lived when certainty was available. Her grandfather had written in 1973 about the pond. He had written about what was in it, not floating in it, not on its banks, but beneath it, in the ground beneath the water, and in the particular subsurface space that a farm pond concealed when it had been excavated, to a depth greater than its agricultural purpose required, when the excavation had proceeded not to the dimensions of a modest livestock watering hole, but to something considerably more deliberate, when the resulting depth and the resulting mud and the resulting decades of accumulated sediment and the resulting appearance of total ordinary unremarkableness had been the point, not the incidental result. Her grandfather's note was careful and did not name values. It referred to contents the way a person referred to contents when they did not wish to describe them to anyone who might read what they were writing. But it was specific about the location, which was the northeast corner, the low corner, the corner with the water, and it was specific about the access, which was not from above, but from below, from a chamber that predated the pond itself, that had been built before the water was there, and before the water was made permanent by the excavation of 1958, and before anyone living had thought to look at a duck pond and ask what was underneath it. She put the paper down carefully and went to the kitchen and drank a glass of water standing at the sink, looking out at the dark yard, at the bare oak, at the nothing that was visible beyond the window at this hour. Then she went back to the spare bedroom and read it again. By the time she had read it a third time, her hands were steady and her breathing was even, and the thing that she had been carrying since the day of the reading in Walter Whitmore's office, that dull, unresigned weight of having been given the least because she was considered worth the least, had begun to change its shape into something she could not yet fully see, but that felt, for the first time in longer than she could account for, like something other than settled fact. Outside, the December wind moved through the bare oak and made the particular sound that bare oaks made, which was somewhere between a sigh and a warning, and the night continued around her, indifferent and ordinary, and entirely unaware of what the Tuesday mail had started and what the duck pond was waiting to give up. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with the old document and a fresh legal pad, and she wrote down everything she needed to understand before she could take a single step further. The questions arranged themselves neatly, which was the quality she appreciated most about questions at moments like this. They were orderly. They could be addressed one at a time, unlike the answers, which she suspected would be considerably less orderly when they arrived. What was beneath the pond, she did not yet know in specifics. Her grandfather's note suggested something stored, something of sufficient importance to require concealment of this scale and this duration, but it named nothing directly. That was the first question. The second was the structure. He had mentioned a chamber, built before the pond, pre-existing. which meant, if the note was to be believed, which she had decided for the moment to provisionally believe, that at some point in the middle of the 20th century, someone had constructed something underground in the northeast corner of the Voss property, and then flooded it or enclosed it beneath water as a means of concealment. The engineering of that was not, she thought, impossible. There were examples throughout the region of old root cellars, even old passages, that had been flooded out by rising water tables or deliberately inundated and forgotten. The third question was access. He had said the access was from below, which she had read and reread, trying to determine what that meant in practical terms. Not from above, not by draining the pond and digging down. From below, from outside the pond's footprint, through an approach she could not yet visualize. The fourth question was her brother's. She sat with that one for a while. If her grandfather had known about the chamber and had written it down, even in this compressed and private way, then the knowledge had existed. It had existed in the family. Her father had lived on that farm for his entire adult life, had walked that northeast field, had passed that pond on 1,000 ordinary days. He had left her that specific piece of ground. He had not left it to Douglas or Richard. He had left it to her. Either her father had not known what his own father had written and had left her the pond as a simple dismissal, the lowest value corner of his estate allocated to the child he valued least, or her father had known. The second possibility sat in the room with a weight that the first did not have. If her father had known, then what had happened in Walter Whitmore's conference room was not a dismissal. It was a transfer. Quiet, deniable, sealed inside the ordinary seeming language of an estate distribution that no one would look at twice, specifically because no one would look at the duck pond twice. Her brothers had argued over the tillable land and the grain bins and the liquid assets, and in doing so they had argued themselves straight past the thing that mattered most, which was precisely what would have been intended. She was not sure she could afford to believe that. It required a degree of deliberateness on her father's part that his history of silence and distance did not easily support. People who wanted to give something to someone usually found a way to tell them. Her father had not told her anything, but he had also given her the pond. She wrote that down on the legal pad, underlined it twice, and sat looking at it until the eastern window began to lighten and the oak tree resolved itself from a dark shape into a specific tree with specific branches, and the Tuesday morning arrived with its grocery lists and its dentist appointments and its absolute refusal to understand what had been set in motion the night before. She called in a personal day to the school. She had 4 of them unused. She used one now, and she drove back out to County Road 14 in the early morning, and she stood on the frozen south bank of the duck pond with her grandfather's note in her coat pocket, and she looked at the water. The single mallard was gone. The pond was still. The ice had advanced overnight at the margins, and the center was darker now, deeper looking, holding whatever it held beneath its cold and ordinary surface. She looked at the drainage structure. She looked at the willows on the north bank. She looked at the ground around the perimeter, trying to see it differently, trying to look at 6 acres of low, wet land the way her grandfather had looked at it, in whatever year he had decided that it was the right place, the best place, the place that would hold the secret the longest. She thought about the 1971 newspaper clipping and the bank consolidation and the records that had been temporarily stored on the Voss property. She thought about what kinds of things a bank might have that were worth storing in a location secure enough to require private property and the particular concealment that a farm offered. She thought about 1971 and what the world had looked like in 1971, and what a man like her grandfather, a private and careful and not interested in explaining himself, might have considered worth holding on to. She stood there a long time, long enough that her feet went cold inside her boots, and the sun climbed to its low winter angle, and the pond continued to hold its silence, reflecting the pale sky, giving nothing away. Then she took out her phone and began making calls. The first was to a well drilling and excavation company in the next county, asking about pump rental rates and pond dewatering services. The man she spoke to was helpful and asked a few practical questions about pond size and soil type and existing drainage infrastructure, and she answered them as accurately as she could. And he gave her a price range that was less than she had feared and more than she could currently manage. The second call was to a man she knew, and a parent of one of her students, who ran a small contracting business and who had, on more than one occasion, expressed the desire to help her in whatever way he could, meaning it genuinely in the uncomplicated way that some people still meant things genuinely. His name was Paul. She asked him, without explaining much, whether he knew anything about draining old farm ponds. He said he knew a little about it and asked why. She said she had come into some property and was trying to understand what she had. He said he would take a look if she wanted. She said she would let him know. She stood at the edge of the pond for another few minutes, and then she walked its perimeter one more time, slowly, looking at the ground, at the sight lines, or at the way the willows on the north side were planted, or had grown in a way that screened the pond from the main farm operation and from County Road, 14 in both directions, which might have been coincidence and might not have been. At the northwest corner, where the ground rose slightly before dropping back to the water, her boot caught on something beneath the snow-dusted leaf litter, something that did not give the way roots gave. She stopped and crouched and cleared the leaves away with her gloved hands. There was concrete there, old concrete, partially buried, its surface broken in one corner by decades of frost heave, but intact enough to identify as something deliberate. A slab roughly 2 feet by 3 feet, set flush with the ground, or nearly flush, its edges straight and formed rather than broken and natural. She cleared the area around it more carefully. There was a seam running around the perimeter of the slab, filled with silt and compacted debris, but present, continuous, the unmistakable geometry of something set in place rather than poured in place, something that covered an opening. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. The cold came through her jacket, and her hands were dirty inside the gloves, and the pond sat 10 feet away, holding its dark and patient silence. And somewhere in the willow stand a bird she couldn't see, shifted on a branch, and was still again. She looked at the slab for a long time. Then she took several photographs. Then she stood up and walked back to her car, slowly, not because she was in no hurry, but because she wanted to be deliberate. And deliberate required a pace that matched the weight of what she was beginning to understand. She sat in the driver's seat with the heat running and her grandfather's note on the passenger seat beside her, and she looked at the photographs on her phone, at the old concrete slab with its hairline seam at the northwest corner of a duck pond in the northeast corner of an 800-acre farm that her brothers had divided between themselves while she received the part that no one wanted. the part that held the question. The part that had been waiting for exactly this long, for someone to come and stand on the frozen ground and be willing to ask what was underneath. She put the car in drive and pulled out onto County Road 14 and headed home. And the question rode with her the entire way, patient as the water, quiet as the ground beneath it. And for the first time since the letter had arrived on a Tuesday, between the grocery lists and the dentist appointments, she felt something that was less like loss and more like the very beginning of something she did not yet have a name for, but that made the air in the car feel different, charged in a way she had to breathe carefully around. She was going to drain the pond. She did not know yet what she would find. But she was going to drain the pond. The first person she told was Paul. She had thought carefully about who that should be in the days between finding the slab and deciding to move. She had made a short list in her head, and then reduced it, and then reduced it again, until only one name remained. And the reason it remained was not that Paul was the most knowledgeable person she knew or the most resourceful, though he was both of those things in the practical, unshowy way of someone who had spent 20 years solving problems with his hands. The reason his name stayed on the list was that he was the least likely to tell anyone what she was doing before she understood what she was doing herself. She drove to his shop on a Saturday morning in late December, 2 days after Christmas, when the roads were clear and the county felt emptied of its usual traffic. She brought the photographs on her phone and her grandfather's note in a clear plastic sleeve, and 2 cups of coffee from the gas station, because Paul's shop coffee was reliably bad, and she was going to need him in a good mood. He looked at the photographs without speaking, scrolling through them slowly on the small screen, enlarging the image of the concrete slab with 2 fingers and examining the seam. He looked at the note, which she had translated from her grandfather's handwriting into typed text on a separate sheet, because she did not want to hand the original to anyone. He read it twice, which was more than she had expected. Then he drank some of his coffee and said, "How deep do you think the pond goes?" She said she wasn't sure. 8 feet at the center was her best estimate, based on what she remembered and what the drainage structure suggested about the original design. He said that draining 8 feet of water from a quarter-acre pond was not a small job, but it was a manageable one, if the drainage outlet was functional, which from her photographs it appeared it might be with some work, and if they could supplement with pump capacity for the final drawdown where the outlet would lose suction. She asked how long. He said it depended on the outlet condition and the pump rate and the time of year, but that January was actually not a bad time, because ground saturation was predictable and the cold kept the mud firmer than it would be in spring. He said maybe a week for the main body of water, more for the residual pooling in the low spots. She asked about cost. He gave her a figure that was not small, but was not impossible. And then he looked at her over his coffee cup with the particular expression of a person who had processed enough of the situation to have a question forming that he was deciding whether to ask. He asked it. He said, "What do you think is down there?" She said she didn't know for certain. She said her grandfather's note suggested something stored. She said the slab at the northwest corner appeared to be an access point to something beneath the pond's footprint. She said she needed to see what was there before she could say anything more specific. He nodded in the way that people nodded when they were accepting incomplete information and choosing to proceed on the basis of trust rather than full disclosure. He said he could clear the week of January 8th She said that would work. She did not tell her brothers. She spent some time in the days after that conversation examining her reasons for this, and concluded that they were not purely strategic, though they were partly that. They were also something older, something that lived in the same place as the knowledge that she had been given the pond while they divided the farm, which was a place where the ordinary obligations of family ran up against the ordinary obligations of self-preservation. And she had to decide, as she had been deciding her whole life in various configurations, which obligation had precedence. She decided it was not deception. She had received a piece of property. She was investigating that property. She was under no legal or ethical obligation to narrate the investigation to people who had taken their portions and moved on. She told herself this clearly and without drama, and mostly believed it. What she did do in those 2 weeks before Paul's crew arrived was research. She spent her evenings at the kitchen table with her laptop and her growing collection of notes, and the particular focused patience that came with having a question she genuinely needed to answer. She read about the Agricultural Credit Bank that had merged in 1971, pulling what records she could find from digitized county histories, and a microfilm archive that the regional library had partially scanned and posted online. The bank had been a significant regional institution for most of the 20th century, the kind of organization that entire farming communities relied on for operating credit and land loans and the particular financial infrastructure of agricultural life. The 1971 consolidation had been larger than the newspaper clipping had suggested. A regional bank merger of that scale involved not just records, but assets, physical assets, of the kind that financial institutions accumulated over decades of operation in a community where transactions were not always abstract, or agricultural loans in that era were sometimes collateralized with physical goods beyond real estate. Certain accounts, particularly older ones, held instruments and items that predated the electronic record-keeping that would eventually render such arrangements unnecessary. Gold coin deposits that had never been converted, bearer bonds from the Depression era, certain agricultural commodity certificates, items that a bank undergoing rapid consolidation and administrative chaos might have found easier to move to secure temporary storage than to properly catalog and transfer through official channels. She could not prove any of this. The records she could access were incomplete, and the gaps in them were exactly the kind of gaps that appeared when something had been deliberately not documented. But she kept reading. She found 2 more things before January arrived. The first was a reference in the County Historical Society's archive to a construction project on the Voss property in the spring of 1957, described briefly in a building permit record as a subsurface agricultural structure, foundation work, northeast quadrant. The permit was issued to Harmon Voss and a contractor, whose name she recognized from other county records as someone who had done significant below-grade work on several properties in the region during that period. The project appeared to have been completed that summer. The pond excavation and expansion, according to the plat records, occurred the following year in 1958. The sequence was clear once she had both pieces. Her grandfather had built something underground in 1957. He had flooded it in 1958. Whatever was inside had gone underwater within a year of being placed there. The second thing she found was harder to interpret. It was a letter, or a fragment of one, in a collection of papers that the Historical Society had received from the estate of a local attorney who had died in the 1990s. The attorney had represented Harmon Voss in various matters over the years. The letter was undated and appeared to be a draft rather than a sent document, incomplete at the bottom, as if the rest of the page had been separated or lost. It was addressed to no one and referred to a custodial arrangement, to the understanding that what had been placed would remain placed, and to the expectation that the rightful party would in time come to understand the nature of what they held. She read that phrase 3 times. The rightful party. She put the laptop down and sat with the phrase for a long time. Then she went to bed and did not sleep well, and in the morning drove to school and taught multiplication tables to children who found them either fascinating or incomprehensible, with very little middle ground, and she did not think about the pond for most of the day, and that was the best she could do. Paul arrived on the morning of January 8th with a crew of 3 and a trailer carrying a submersible pump rated for high-volume discharge, along with the tools he would need to assess and restore function to the drainage outlet on the south bank. The day was cold and clear, the sky a hard, uncomplicated blue, the kind of winter sky that made everything look sharp and slightly unreal. Margaret was there when they arrived. She had taken the week as personal days, on all 4 remaining ones, telling the school principal it was a family property matter, which was not untrue. Paul's crew worked the drainage outlet first. The corroded stem valve required more effort than the visible corrosion had suggested, but the concrete head wall was sound, and the culvert pipe was unobstructed, which was the important thing. And by mid-morning, they had restored partial function to the outlet and begun the initial drawdown. The water level dropped perhaps 3 inches in the first 2 hours, which was slow but measurable. The pump went into service in the afternoon, a heavy hose snaking from the pond's center to a discharge point Paul had identified at the edge of the property, where the released water would flow naturally into the field drainage ditch without creating problems. The 2 systems together, outlet and pump, increased the drawdown rate substantially. By evening of the first day, the water had dropped roughly 14 inches. The ice at the margins had grounded itself on the emerging mud flat and lay in irregular sheets, tilting and cracking as the water receded beneath it. The center of the pond was a narrowing eye of open water, still dark, still unrevealing. She stood on the south bank in the failing light and watched, and Paul stood beside her and said it was going about as well as it could go, and she said that was good. And they were quiet for a while in the comfortable way of people who did not need to fill silences. She had not told Paul what she expected to find. She was not sure she could have told him even if she had wanted to, because what she expected existed somewhere between specific hope and the kind of faith that did not easily translate into language. She had a grandfather's private note, a fragment of a letter, a building permit, and a concrete slab with a seam at the northwest corner of a pond that nobody had wanted. That was what she had. It was not nothing, and it was not certainty. Her phone rang twice that first evening. Both calls were from Douglas. She let them go to voicemail. His message on the second call was brief and mentioned that he had heard from someone, he did not say who, that she had brought equipment out to the northeast corner. He said he was just checking in. He said to call him back when she got a chance. She did not call him back. The second day, the water dropped another 20 inches. The mud flat at the south and east margins was now fully exposed, a dark and glistening expanse of silt that bore the surface textures of long submersion, smooth where the current had run, ridged where sediment had settled in organized layers. She could see the bottom clearly in the shallows for the first time. Old leaves, compressed almost to a solid mat. The rusted remains of something she could not identify, a fence post perhaps, or old pipe, that had been submerged long enough to become part of the landscape. She walked the exposed margins carefully, wearing the rubber waders Paul had brought as a precaution. The mud was deep enough in places that she sank to mid-calf with each step, the suction pulling at her boots as she lifted them. She stayed near the firmer ground at the edges and moved slowly, to nothing visible yet at the northwest corner. The slab she had found was now high and dry above the waterline, and she could see it more fully than before, its dimensions approximately what she had estimated, its surface more clearly formed concrete rather than the random broken edges of natural stone. The seam was unambiguous in the winter light. Whatever was beneath that slab had been put there to be opened, eventually, by someone who knew to look. On the third day, Richard called. He was more direct than Douglas had been. He said he had heard she was draining the pond. He asked what she expected to find in a duck pond. He said it in the tone he used for things he found slightly beneath engaging, that particular register of condescension that had defined his manner toward her since approximately the time she was 12 years old. He said if she was looking to improve the property value, she should know that low-lying pond ground in this county sold for almost nothing, and she'd be lucky to recoup the cost of the equipment. She said she understood that. He said she should have just let him buy her out when he offered, which he had not actually offered, or had offered in a way so clearly designed to be refused that it barely qualified as an offer. She said she appreciated his input. He said she had always been stubborn, which he seemed to intend as criticism, and which she received as a form of compliment she was not going to explain to him. After she hung up, she stood at the pond's edge in the cold afternoon air and watched the water level, and the number she was working toward was still several days away. And that was all right. Now, she had waited longer than this for things that mattered considerably less. Paul's daughter, who was in Margaret's class and had apparently said something at dinner, was the source of the call that arrived from a woman named Darla, from the local church community group on the fourth day. Darla was not malicious. Darla was the kind of person who organized casserole rotas during illnesses and remembered everyone's birthdays and communicated information between people on the principle that connectivity was its own form of care. Darla wanted to know if Margaret was all right, and if she was having money troubles, and if there was anything the community could do. Margaret thanked her and said everything was fine, and yes, she was draining a pond. And no, she was not in crisis, and she appreciated the thought. After the call, she stood in her kitchen and thought about how it was that she lived in a place where draining a duck pond generated enough conversation to produce a welfare check within 72 hours. And then she thought that this was the same quality of a place that had also produced Paul, who had shown up with his crew without asking for full disclosure. And those things were, she understood, related. By the end of the fourth day, the main body of the pond was gone. What remained was the residual pooling in the deepest central depression, a shallow lake of perhaps 2 feet of water over an unknown depth of mud, and the mud flat surrounding it, which now extended to the northwest corner and covered the area where she had first found the slab. She could see the slab clearly. She could see that the ground around it was slightly elevated relative to the surrounding mud, suggesting the presence of structure below. The elevation was subtle, no more than a few inches, the kind of thing you would not notice if you were not looking for it. Paul crouched beside the slab and examined the seam with a flashlight. He said it was a precast concrete lid, likely lifted rather than hinged. He said the fit was tight enough that it had not leaked appreciably in however long it had been in place. He said lifting it would require either brute force or a proper grip point, and that without a visible handle, the brute force option was probably going to be a pry bar, and that he would rather not do that until the area was stable enough to work safely. She agreed. They would wait until the residual pooling was reduced further, which the pump would accomplish overnight if they kept it running. She went home that night in a state of suspension that was not quite anxiety and not quite anticipation, but lived somewhere between the two, in the specific tension of a person who has moved consistently towards something and has now reached the point where movement meets reality, and the two have to reconcile. She thought about the phrase from the letter, the rightful party. She thought about the building permit from 1957. Subsurface agricultural structure, the euphemism of a man who did not wish to be specific. She thought about the bank consolidation of 1971 and the temporary holding arrangement and the newspaper column Inches that had described it in the tone of something unremarkable. She thought about her father's face in the hospice room, in those last days when he was mostly somewhere else, and about the one afternoon when he had been briefly more present and had looked at her from the bed with an expression she had not been able to read at the time, that she had taken for the ordinary vagueness of a man very near the end. Now she thought it might have been something else, relief perhaps, or the particular peace of someone who has placed a thing and can trust that it will be found. She slept, eventually, in the incomplete way of someone whose mind had agreed to rest, but had not entirely committed to the decision. In the morning, she drove to the pond before Paul's crew arrived and stood at the northwest corner in the early light. The residual pooling had receded substantially overnight, the pump running steady through the dark hours, and the mud in the central depression was lower by another several inches. The slab was fully accessible. The ground around it was firm enough to stand on. She crouched beside it and placed her palm on the concrete surface, which was cold and slightly rough under her hand, pocked by decades of weathering and the particular textures that concrete developed when it had been buried for a long time. She could feel the seam under her fingertips when she ran them along the edge. She did not try to open it. She waited. Paul arrived at 7:30 and looked at the site and said the ground was ready. He sent one of his crew back to the trailer for the pry bars and the come-along he had brought as a contingency, and they assembled at the northwest corner with the particular purposefulness of people who have a specific physical task in front of them and understand what is required. It took longer than she had expected and less long than she had feared. The lid was heavy, considerably heavier than its dimensions suggested, which indicated thickness she had not accounted for. Paul's man got the pry bar into the seam on the east side, where the gap was slightly wider, and worked it carefully, and the lid shifted fractionally, enough to break the seal of mud and time that had held it. And from that point, it was a matter of leverage applied patiently until the concrete moved in a single clean arc on a hinge mechanism that was, she realized with a start, still functional. The lid had not been set in place. It had been engineered to open. The hinge was at the north side. The lid swung up and back and settled against the bank with a heavy, decisive sound, and the opening was there. She looked into it. The access shaft was roughly 3 feet square, lined with concrete that was in substantially better condition than the exterior of the lid, protected from the elements by 70 years of immersion. Iron rungs were set into the east wall, descending into darkness. She counted 5 visible before the angle of the morning light failed to reach further. Paul shone a flashlight into the shaft. The beam found a floor roughly 15 feet below, though the angle made estimation difficult. What it also found, against the far wall at the bottom of the shaft, was the edge of a structure, a corner, a surface that was clearly not natural, not soil or concrete, but something else. Something that had a regularity and a sheen to it that registered even at this distance. She could not speak for a moment. The cold air came up from the shaft and touched her face, dry and still, the breath of something sealed. Paul said quietly that someone should go down. She said she would go. He said he would hold the light. She lowered herself into the shaft with the careful economy of movement that the confined space required, finding each rung with her boot before trusting her weight to it, descending in the particular silence of a person engaged in an act whose meaning was still assembling itself around her. The concrete walls were cold and close. 15 feet was not far, and it took her longer than it should have because she moved deliberately, feeling the shaft narrow around her and then open slightly as she descended below the pond's base level and into the space beneath. She reached the bottom and turned. The chamber was not what she had imagined, which was something rough and improvised. It was built with intention and care, and the particular seriousness of someone who expected what was stored here to remain stored for a very long time. The walls were reinforced concrete, formed and cured properly, their surfaces smooth and damp at the upper margins, where moisture had permeated over the decades, but dry lower down, where the construction had held against infiltration. The floor was concrete as well, sealed with something that had protected it against the moisture that would otherwise have destroyed anything stored there. The ceiling was low, perhaps 6.5 feet, but flat and level. The chamber was larger than she had prepared herself for. She could see perhaps 20 feet in each direction before the light she had brought with her. A powerful LED flashlight Paul had handed down the shaft reached its limit. And in that space, organized with the same meticulous discipline she had seen in her grandfather's handwritten accounts, and in the building permit, and in every record he had left behind, were the things he had placed there. She understood later, after the people who knew about such things had come and gone, and the assessments had been made, and the numbers she had not yet allowed herself to say aloud had been said by other people whose job it was to say them, that what she was seeing in the first moments was not its full extent. The chamber extended back from the shaft access farther than she could initially determine. A second section connected through an interior opening that she would not discover until she had moved farther in. But in those first seconds, standing at the base of the shaft with the cold, dry air of a sealed space around her, what she saw was enough. Along the left wall, stacked on custom-built wooden platforms that had survived the decades better than she would have expected because they had been sealed against moisture before the chamber was closed, were cases. And they were metal, the kind of military surplus storage containers that had been available cheaply in the post-war years, sealed with mechanisms that appeared to have been augmented beyond their original design. There were many of them. She counted initially, without being fully aware she was counting. She stopped at 40 and understood that she was not at the end of them. Against the far wall, she could see shelving, Not improvised shelving, but built shelving, solid and deliberate. On the shelves were further containers, smaller ones, and documents in protective cases, and items whose shapes she could not immediately identify, but that were clearly not random. She moved to the nearest of the large containers and looked at what was marked on its exterior, which was her grandfather's handwriting, angular and deliberate. The same handwriting she had recognized on the note she had found in the spare bedroom box, and what he had written there was a date and a reference code, and nothing else. She tried to open it. The mechanism required a key she did not have, which she had expected, and she studied the container and understood that forcing it would be wrong, that everything here was in a condition of preservation that depended on being opened correctly, and that correctness in this case was not a minor concern. She walked further into the chamber, past the stacked cases, and found the interior opening, which was an arched passage about 4 feet wide and 5 feet high that led into the second section. The second section was different. Where the first had the quality of organized storage, the second had the quality of a vault. So the walls here were faced with a secondary material over the concrete, a sealed facing that had kept conditions exceptionally stable. The air was noticeably drier. The temperature was more even. The sense of controlled preservation was deliberate and comprehensive. There were shelves here as well. On them were items in archival cases, flat and secured, the kind used for documents and certificates, and instruments that needed to be kept in stable conditions over long periods. There were also, on the lower shelves, objects that she recognized from her research in the weeks before, or recognized not individually, but categorically. The shapes were consistent with what she had read about, the dimensional profiles of items that held value not in their mass, but in what they represented, in what had been promised by their existence, done in the particular financial language of a different era. She stood in the second section for a long time without moving. The flashlight held steady in her hand. The cold, dry air was around her. 15 feet above, Paul was holding a larger flashlight at the shaft opening, and the beam of it came down at an angle that caught the edge of the interior passage and threw a faint light against the near wall. She thought about her grandfather, who had been dead before she was born, and whose face she knew only from a single formal photograph that had hung in her grandmother's house, and then disappeared after her grandmother died. She thought about the 1957 building permit, and the contractor, and the summer's work, and the decision, made in private and apparently never fully shared, to close this space and fill it with water and leave it to time. She thought about her father. She thought about the duck pond and the Tuesday letter, and Walter Whitmore's conference room, and the careful, precise allocation of an estate that had sent her brothers away with millions of dollars in land and equipment, and had sent her here, to the bottom of a shaft, beneath a flooded field in January, standing in a dry, concrete room in the company of things whose value she did not yet fully understand, but that she understood, with a certainty that arrived not as excitement, but as quiet and overwhelming weight, was not small. She climbed back up the shaft carefully, finding each rung, emerging into the cold morning air above. Paul was there, and his crew was there, and they looked at her face, and something in her expression gave them a version of the answer before she said anything. She told them they needed to stop work for the day. She told them she needed to make some calls. She told Paul specifically that she needed him to say nothing to anyone about what they had found until she told him otherwise. and she said it in a tone that communicated clearly that this was not a casual request, and he said he understood, and she believed him. Then she walked to her car and sat in it with the heater running and her hands in her lap, and she stayed there for several minutes, doing nothing except being very still inside a situation that wasn't still, that was in fact moving faster now than anything in her life had moved in as long as she could remember. When she took out her phone, her hands were steady. She made the first call to the estate attorney she had consulted briefly in the weeks after the will reading, on a woman named Claire Abernathy in Carver Falls, who had a reputation for exactness and discretion that Margaret had confirmed through 2 separate references before trusting. She told Claire that she had found something on her property that required immediate expert evaluation, and that she needed to know, before anything else, what her legal position was regarding contents discovered on inherited property in this state. Claire's response was measured and precise and professionally unexcited, which was exactly the right response, and she asked Margaret to come in the following morning and to bring documentation of the inheritance and any documentation she had of the discovery. The second call took longer to decide on. She sat with her phone in her hand for several minutes before she dialed. When the call connected and the archivist at the County Historical Society's research line answered, she asked about the process for engaging an independent specialist to evaluate historical artifacts found on private property, specifically items of potential significant value from the mid-20th century, and whether there were particular categories of specialist that would be appropriate for documents and financial instruments of that era. The archivist was helpful and gave her 3 names. She wrote them down. Then she put the phone on the passenger seat and looked out through the windshield at the pond, at the mud flat and the tilting ice sheets, and the exposed concrete of the south drainage head wall and the willow stand on the north bank, bare and patient, and the small square of the access lid lying open at the northwest corner, with Paul standing near it in the cold, respectful of whatever she was working through. The money, the actual figure, was not something she would know for some time. The process of determining it was slow and careful and required the kind of expertise that did not rush, and she understood that. She was not thinking about the figure yet. She was thinking about her grandfather's note, about the phrase "the rightful party," about the building permit from 1957 and the bank consolidation of 1971, and the arrangement that had apparently been made, in private and without formal documentation, between a careful private man and the institution whose assets he had agreed to hold. She was thinking about 70 years. And she was thinking about her father in the hospice room, now in the last clear afternoon, looking at her with an expression she had not known how to read. She thought she understood it now. She started the car and sat with the heater for another moment, and then she drove home to compile her documents and prepare for the morning. The attorney's office was warm and precisely organized in the way that competent legal practices were organized. Everything in its place, nothing decorative that was not also functional. Claire Abernathy listened to Margaret's account with a quality of attention that did not interrupt and did not editorialize and did not shift its focus when the account moved into territory that might have surprised a less experienced listener. When Margaret finished, Claire asked several questions that were technical and specific and revealed that she had already considered most of the obvious complications before being asked about them. The legal position was, Claire explained, relatively clear in its foundations if not entirely without complexity in its particulars. Property and contents discovered on inherited land belonged to the heir unless there was a prior legal claim that could be demonstrated. The nature of any prior claim from the institution that had originally stored the assets, if that was indeed what the chamber contained, would depend on a number of factors, including whether the arrangement had been formalized and what records existed of it. Given the informal nature of what the 1971 newspaper article described, and given the subsequent decades of non-action by any institutional party, the legal position was probably favorable, though probably was a word Claire used carefully and did not intend as a guarantee. What mattered most in the immediate term, Claire said, was documentation. A comprehensive inventory of the chamber's contents needed to be made under controlled conditions before anything was moved or disturbed, and the inventory needed to be witnessed and time-stamped in a way that would withstand legal scrutiny. She recommended a specific protocol and offered to coordinate it. Margaret said she would like that. The first specialist arrived 3 days later. He was a man named Gerald Fitch, who had spent 30 years at a regional museum before retiring to a consulting practice that focused on historical documents and financial instruments from the early and mid-20th century. He was precise and quiet, and moved through the chamber with the economy of someone who had spent a career in confined spaces with fragile things. He spent 4 hours in the first section and another 3 in the second section, and came up the shaft at the end of the day and removed his gloves and stood in the cold January air and said, in a tone that was professionally modulated, but not entirely containing what it was modulating, that he would need several more days and at least one additional colleague, and that the inventory was going to be more substantial than he had initially anticipated. She asked him to say more. He said he could not responsibly characterize what he had seen until he had examined it properly. He said the preservation conditions were exceptional, which he had not expected for a structure of this age and this type of construction. He said the range of materials was broader than a single holding arrangement would typically suggest, which might indicate either a more complex original transaction or subsequent additions, the timeline of which would require investigation. She asked him to come back the next morning. He said he would be there at 7. The second specialist came on the 5th day. She was a woman named Priya Subramaniam, who worked in the authentication of historical financial instruments for an organization that Margaret had not previously heard of, and that Gerald Fitch had described as the appropriate people to call without elaborating on why, and whose manner was precise and slightly severe in the way of people who spent their professional lives establishing what was real and what was not. Priya spent her first day in the chamber photographing everything without moving anything, and her second day beginning the process of opening the sealed cases with the kind of instruments that did not damage what they opened. The wooden platforms on which the metal cases rested had survived better than expected because whoever had built them had applied a sealant that was still partially effective. The cases themselves were in varying conditions. Most were sound. A few had suffered surface corrosion that had not penetrated to the contents. Several were in exceptional condition, their seals intact, their interiors dry and stable when opened. On the 8th day of the inventory, Priya Subramaniam came up the shaft in the mid-afternoon with her clipboard and her photographs and a careful, composed expression, and she said, in a tone that made Margaret feel as though the ground beneath her was slightly less reliable than it had been that morning, that she had completed the initial assessment of the document cases in the second section, and that she wanted to discuss the preliminary findings. They sat in Paul's truck with the heat on, because the cold had become a constant by now, wearing into concentration, and Priya spread her papers on the dashboard in a way that suggested she was not unaccustomed to delivering significant information in improvised settings. She explained that the second section of the chamber contained, among other things, a collection of bearer bonds from multiple issuances across the 1940s and 1950s, some of which had matured and some of which were of a type that retained value through their negotiability regardless of official maturity. She explained that there were agricultural credit certificates of a kind that had been issued by certain regional institutions during specific periods, and that had particular legal characteristics she would need to discuss with someone specialized in that area of financial law. She explained that there were gold certificates from a period prior to the 1934 Gold Reserve Act, whose status and current valuation she had already placed calls about, but did not yet have final word on. She said none of these figures were finalized. Then she said that the preliminary numbers she was working with, unconservatively and without accounting for certain categories she had not yet fully assessed, suggested a total value in the range of what she would not have expected to find anywhere outside a major institutional vault, and certainly not beneath a farm pond in Harmon County. Margaret asked her to be specific. Priya looked at the papers on the dashboard and then at Margaret and said that her preliminary conservative estimate for the contents of the second section alone was in the range of $230 to $260 million, and that the first section, which contained additional categories of material she was still assessing, appeared to represent a comparable, if not greater, sum. The truck was warm, and the windows had fogged slightly at the edges, and outside the pond was a flat expanse of drying mud and tilted ice and bare willows against a January sky. And for a long moment, Margaret said nothing at all. She had known, in the way that careful, honest thinking sometimes allowed you to know something before you had the evidence for it, that the number was going to be significant. She had not been certain. She had not allowed herself to fully commit to the certainty. But she had known, in the particular quiet that had settled over her since the morning she had read her grandfather's note on the floor of the spare bedroom, that whatever was beneath that pond was not incidental, not minor, not the kind of thing that someone built a sealed, reinforced concrete chamber to hold and then covered with water and waited 7 decades for someone to find. She had known it was something. She had not known it was this. She thanked Priya for her work. She said that was helpful. She asked what the remaining assessment timeline looked like. Priya said another 10 to 14 days for the complete inventory. She said there would need to be additional specialists for certain categories. She said the legal questions around provenance and prior claims would run in parallel with the assessment and might take longer. Margaret said that was understood. She sat in the truck for a while after Priya had gone back to the site. The mud flat around the pond was drying at its edges now, the January air pulling moisture from the surface, and in certain lights the exposed bottom had a texture like old leather, brown and layered, and giving nothing away. The shaft opening was a dark square at the northwest corner. Paul's crew had erected a temporary covering over it after the second day, a simple frame and tarp, both to protect the access from weather and to reduce visibility from the road. She thought about $300 million, or something in that neighborhood, which was where the total appeared to be heading once the full assessment was complete. She thought about what that number was and what it was not. It was not the answer to everything. It was not a guarantee of anything, except that her situation was different now than it had been before, and that the difference was so large as to require an entirely new way of thinking about what came next. It was also, she thought, the answer to the question she had been carrying since January 8th, when she had watched her brothers divide a farm between themselves in a conference room that smelled of old carpet. Or more precisely, it was evidence for an answer she had not known she was waiting for, which was whether her father had dismissed her or entrusted her, whether the duck pond was the least thing he had had to give or the most. The number suggested one of those was more likely than the other. She called Claire Abernathy from the truck. She said the preliminary assessment was complete and that she would like to come in and discuss next steps. Claire said tomorrow morning, and Margaret said yes. Then she got out of the truck and walked to the edge of the pond and stood there in the cold for a little while, looking at where the water had been and at the shape of the depression it had left, at the mud and the ice and the bare willows and the particular winter stillness of a place that had held something for a very long time and had now been asked to give it up. The mallard was back. She had not seen it in days, and then there it was, standing at the south margin on the firm ground where the ice had grounded, regarding her with the same neutral surveillance as before. She looked at it. It looked at her. She said, aloud, and to no one in particular, that she thought they were going to be all right. The duck gave no opinion. The pond sat in its new shape, open and exposed and still, and the sky above it was the color of old pewter. And beyond the willow stand, somewhere in the distance, the county continued its ordinary business, driving its roads and tending its fields and having its conversations, entirely unaware that in the northeast corner of a farm property off County Road 14, beneath 6 acres of ground that no one had wanted and everyone had dismissed, the duck pond had given up its secret at last. The news did not spread the way she had feared it would, which was all at once, and without her having any control over the shape of it. It spread instead the way most important things spread in small counties, incrementally and imperfectly, traveling through partial information and inference until it arrived at people in a form that was recognizable but not quite accurate, which was in some ways better than accuracy, because it gave her time. The first person who confronted her about it was Douglas. He came to her house on a Wednesday evening in the 3rd week of January without calling ahead, which was characteristic of him in situations he had decided required directness. He knocked twice, and she opened the door, and he was standing on her porch in his work coat, with the expression he used when he believed he had been wronged, and was prepared to be reasonable about it, for approximately as long as it took him to establish that he had been wronged. She let him in. He sat at the kitchen table, and she made coffee she did not particularly want, and they were silent for a moment, in the way of people who are each waiting for the other to establish the terrain of the conversation. Douglas established it first, which was also characteristic. He said he had been hearing things. He said he had heard from people at the elevator, and from the Farm Bureau office, and from a woman at the county assessor's office, that there was some kind of significant activity out at her corner of the property, that there were specialists coming in and out, that she had retained an attorney. He said he was not trying to interfere with whatever she was doing, which was the statement he made when he intended to interfere with whatever she was doing. He said he just wanted to understand. She sat across the table from him and looked at his face and thought about what she owed him, which required real consideration rather than the reflexive answer that resentment would have produced. She told him. Not everything, not at that moment. She told him she had found something in the chamber beneath the pond, and she told him it appeared to contain materials of significant financial and historical value that were currently being assessed, and that she was working with legal counsel on the question of provenance and prior claims. She told him the preliminary numbers were substantial. He asked what substantial meant. She told him the preliminary figure that Priya had given her. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the one that had preceded the conversation. Douglas was a man who had spent 2 decades in agricultural finance and was not easily surprised by numbers, but this number surprised him. She could see it in the way his face did not change, which was the way his face reacted when he was absorbing something he needed time to process without displaying his reaction. He said, "And you found this?" "In the duck pond," she said. "Beneath it?" "Yes." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, with a precision she respected because it cost him something, "Dad knew." It was not a question. She said she believed so. Yes. He looked at the table. He looked at his coffee. He said he had always assumed the northeast corner was the low ground, the problem ground, the part of the farm that needed drainage work and never produced reliable yield, and was worth less per acre than anything else they owned. She said, "I know." He said he had told Richard to let her have it when they were talking about what to allocate to Margaret. He said Richard had agreed. He said they had both figured it was the kindest way to give her something without giving up anything that mattered. She heard that and held it for a moment, turning it over, feeling its weight. The kindest way. The dismissal that had been framed as generosity. The gift of the thing no one valued dressed up as consideration. She said, without particular anger, that she understood. He looked at her then, with an expression that had the quality of a man reassessing a map he had been using for a long time, and discovering that several of the landmarks were not where he had placed them. He said he was sorry. Not in the way that people said it when they were performing contrition, but quietly, without elaboration, in the way that people said it when they meant it, and did not have more words available. She said she appreciated that. He left an hour later, and they were not reconciled, not in any sense that decades of distance could be addressed in a single kitchen conversation, but something had shifted, had been acknowledged, which was more than the past had typically offered them. Richard's response was different, which she had expected. Richard called rather than coming in person, which was also characteristic. His call came 2 days after Douglas's visit, by which point the information had moved further through the community and arrived at Richard in a form that was more complete than what Douglas had received, and that had been in transit long enough to acquire the particular charge that significant news accumulated as it traveled. He said several things in sequence. He said he had heard she had found something, and she confirmed it. He said he hoped she was not being taken advantage of by outside parties with an interest in the property, which was concern framed as doubt, and she recognized it as such. And he said that he had always believed the northeast corner had been underassessed, and that he had said so to their father on more than one occasion, which she did not believe, but which was not worth arguing. Then he said, with a shift in tone that dropped the pretense of the preceding statements, "I think we should talk about the family interest in what was found, about the estate." She had prepared for this. Claire Abernathy had prepared her for this in considerably more precise terms than her own preparation would have achieved. She said that Claire had thoroughly reviewed the estate documentation and the terms of the will, and that her position was legally clear. She said she would have Claire's office send him a letter if he wanted the formal version. He said he was not talking about the legal version. She said she knew. He said family did not operate on legal documents, which was a statement she found genuinely interesting, coming from a man who had sat in Walter Whitmore's office and accepted the legal distribution of 800 acres of farmland without raising any objections about the family interest in any of it. She said she heard what he was saying and that she would be in touch. She ended the call and sat with it for a moment, and what she felt was not satisfaction exactly. It was something more textured than satisfaction. It was the feeling of a person who has spent a long time in a position they didn't choose, defined by how others had positioned them, and who has discovered that the position was not fixed, had never been fixed, had in fact been entirely contingent on everyone involved agreeing to treat it as permanent. She had stopped agreeing. The legal process moved with the organized deliberateness of legal processes that had been properly prepared for. Claire Abernathy was in contact with the county assessor's office, with the state historical preservation office, and with a specialist in financial law who had experience with exactly the kind of mid-century institutional arrangements that the chamber appeared to represent. The question of prior claim was addressed systematically and with the patience that it required. The short version of what emerged over the following weeks was this. The bank that had arranged the original custodial holding in the 1950s and 1960s had ceased to exist as a legal entity through several subsequent mergers, the last of which had itself been acquired and dissolved in the late 1990s. The chain of institutional inheritance was fragmented enough, and the original arrangement informal enough, that no surviving entity could demonstrate a clean legal claim to the contents of the chamber. What existed on paper was fragmentary and contradictory, and pointed in several directions simultaneously, none of them clearly. The gold certificates required separate handling because of their particular legal history under federal law, and that conversation was longer and more technical, but the conclusion, after expert analysis, was that the specific certificates in the chamber fell within categories that had been subject to a 1985 ruling that Margaret's financial attorney described as favorable in a tone that communicated the favorable meant what she hoped it meant. The bearer bonds were valued and their negotiability confirmed. The agricultural credit certificates required the most specialized assessment and took the longest, but the assessment, when it came, supported the preliminary numbers in the aggregate. The final figure arrived in March, on a morning that was beginning to think about spring in the tentative way of mornings that were not yet committed to warmth, but were no longer entirely committed to cold. Claire called at 9:15 and read it to her in the precise, professionally calm way that she did everything, and the number was $319 million and some amount of additional hundreds of thousands that neither of them focused on particularly, because at a certain level of magnitude, the trailing figures ceased to be the relevant information. Margaret wrote it on the legal pad she kept beside the phone. She looked at what she had written. Then she thanked Claire and said she would come in next week, and they said goodbye, and she put the phone down and stood in her kitchen for a while, looking out the window at the yard, at the oak tree, at the ordinary February morning, arranging itself beyond the glass. $319 million. She had known the number was coming, and had still not fully prepared for it, which she understood was not a failure of preparation, but a simple property of certain realities. Some things could not be fully absorbed in advance. They had to be lived into, slowly, in the same way that grief was not available all at once, but arrived in portions across a period of time that had no reliable endpoint. The transformation of her life did not happen dramatically or all at once. She had expected, in some vague way, that it might, that the news would produce a sudden restructuring of everything around her. Instead, it moved through the practical layers of her existence with the same methodical patience she had applied to everything else, one decision at a time, one settled obligation at a time. The credit card debt from her mother's final expenses was the first thing she addressed, which cost a sum so small relative to what she now held that the transaction felt almost notional. But the credit card had weighed on her for 3 years, had been a constant low-level pressure she had carried so long it had become part of the texture of ordinary life. And its absence changed something in the air of the house that she had not expected. The house felt lighter, not larger, just less compressed. She paid off the mortgage. She replaced the water heater, which had finally surrendered in February, with a timing that struck her as slightly theatrical. She took the car to the mechanic and told him to fix everything that needed fixing, which he did. And the bill was the kind of bill that a month ago would have required deliberation, and which she now paid without deliberation, and drove home thinking about the difference between those two experiences and what that difference meant about how much of her cognitive life had been occupied, for years, by the management of scarcity. She stayed at the school through the end of the year. This was a decision some people found surprising. She did not find it surprising. Her students were in the middle of their school year, and she was in the middle of teaching them, and the fact that she no longer needed the salary did not mean the work was finished, or that the commitment had expired. She had told her second graders she would see them through to June, and she intended to do that. But she told her principal, in a private conversation in March, that she would not be returning the following year. She said it with a clarity that she recognized as the clarity of someone who was making a decision from abundance rather than scarcity. And the difference in how that felt was significant. The principal said she would be missed, and meant it. And Margaret said she would miss the school too, and also meant it. Paul's business was the next decision, because Paul had made something possible for her in January, and she did not intend to let that go unacknowledged. She called him in late February and said she would like to discuss something, and he came over on a Saturday morning, and she told him what she wanted to do, which was to fund a significant expansion of his operation if he was interested in that, on terms that she and Claire had worked out together, and that were designed to give Paul genuine ownership rather than the kind of obligation that investment sometimes created. He sat with it for a while and asked several practical questions, and then said yes, and they shook hands on it. And that was that. She thought about the broader community in the way she had always thought about it, which was without sentimentality, but with a genuine sense of interconnection. The understanding that the school where she had taught for 14 years, and the library where she did her research, and the volunteer fire department, and the regional food bank were all part of the fabric of a place she had chosen to live in, and that she now had the capacity to strengthen that fabric in ways she had not previously possessed. She established a fund through the County Community Foundation. She did not name it after herself, which was a decision she made without difficulty, and that required no explanation to anyone who knew her. The fund was designed to support a specific set of purposes: educational programming for rural schools in the region, infrastructure grants for volunteer emergency services, and a rotating scholarship that sent students from the county to four-year institutions with the financial support that made attendance genuinely possible rather than technically possible. She thought about her grandfather when she made these decisions, about the man who had built a concrete chamber in 1957 and covered it with water and kept what was inside it for reasons she would never fully know. He had been a private man, meticulous and self-contained, and she did not know what his intentions had been, whether he had planned from the beginning to pass this on, or whether the plan had emerged over time, or whether her father had been the one who understood what needed to happen and had made the choice that he made in Walter Whitmore's office with full knowledge of what he was doing. She had decided it did not entirely matter. The outcome was the same. The rightful party had found what had been placed. The custodianship had passed, as her grandfather's fragmentary letter had suggested it would, to someone who would understand the nature of what they held. She hoped she was understanding it correctly. She did not know for certain. Certainty was not available. What was available was intention and attention, and the same patient honesty that had gotten her through 14 years of second grade, and 4 hours in a notary's waiting room, and a January week standing at the edge of a frozen pond, watching the water go down. Those things she had in sufficient supply. She went back to the pond in April, on a morning when the air had finally committed to warmth, and the willows on the north bank had released the first faint green of new leaves. The mud had dried through March and was beginning to firm. Someone had asked her, through Claire, whether she intended to refill the pond, given the water rights and the wildlife habitat considerations, and she had said yes, she did. In time. The chamber had been properly documented, and its contents removed under the supervision of multiple independent witnesses, and the whole thing recorded for legal purposes, and archived in a way that satisfied everyone who needed satisfying. When the pond returned to its shape, it would be a pond again. A duck pond. Unremarkable from the road, she stood on the south bank and looked at the empty depression and the concrete head wall and the willow stand and the blue sky above all of it. She thought about what it meant to be given something that everyone else had seen as worthless, and to look at it honestly, and to stay with the question of what it actually was long enough to find out. She thought about patience as a form of intelligence, about the kind of attention that did not require certainty to keep going, about her grandfather's discipline and her father's silence, and the strange, oblique language of people who communicated the most important things sideways and through implication, and through the simple act of leaving something for someone who would eventually be ready to receive it. The mallard was back. She had come to think of it as the same duck, which she understood was probably not ornithologically accurate and did not care. It was standing at the north margin of the exposed bed in the new April light, regarding her. She thought about Douglas and his expression in her kitchen when she had told him the number. She thought about the word sorry, said quietly and without elaboration, and what it had cost him to say it, and what it had meant that she had heard it. She thought about Richard, who had not said sorry, who had sent a letter through his attorney in March that raised certain claims and received in response a letter from Claire that addressed each of them with the precise, documented thoroughness of someone who had prepared for exactly this. Richard had not pursued it further. She did not know if he would. She had decided to think about other things while she waited to find out. She thought about the day the letter had arrived, on a Tuesday, between the grocery lists and the dentist appointments, and how she had stood at the kitchen counter and read it twice, holding the edge of something enormous without knowing its shape. She thought about all the days between that Tuesday and this April morning, the research and the questions and the spare bedroom floor and the legal pad and the calls from her brothers and the cold mornings at the pond edge and the shaft and the dry air of the sealed chamber and Priya's voice in the fogged truck telling her the number and the weight of it settling, slowly over weeks, into something she could carry. She thought about her students, who would be back in their classroom on Monday, working on their multiplication tables with the same mixture of fascination and incomprehension, the same division between those who found it straightforward and those who found it impenetrable, and those who were still deciding which camp they occupied. She would see them through to June. She had said she would. The pond sat in its new emptiness, patient and open, waiting to be filled again. She felt, standing there in the April light, the particular quality of a thing completed. Not finished, exactly. Her life wasn't finished, and the work she intended to do with what she had been given was barely started. But completed in the sense that a circle was completed, the sense that a thing had returned to its starting point, having changed its shape along the way. The sense that what had been closed was now open, and what had been hidden was now known, and what had been dismissed was now understood. Her grandfather had placed a trust in 1957 and covered it with water and left it for the rightful party. The rightful party had arrived in December, carrying a legal pad and a borrowed flashlight and the accumulated stubbornness of a person who had been underestimated for long enough to know exactly how underestimation worked and what it left unguarded. She looked at the duck. The duck looked at her. The willows moved in the small April wind. She turned and walked back to her car along the gravel track, and the county spread out around her in all its ordinary, particular, unremarkable beauty. And she drove home along County Road 14 with the window down and the spring air coming through it, cool and green-smelling, carrying the specific promise that the end of one season always made to the beginning of the next. She was all right, more than all right. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, standing at the beginning of the rest of it, holding what she had been given with both hands, finally and completely, and without apology. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.